Harry, we were talking about the relationship between the Jewish people and the Gentile people, between Hagar and Sarah, between freedom and slavery. And I think that we can understand what Paul's doing in his context, but once in a while it disturbs me in terms of the ways that we could misinterpret that or reinterpret that in ways that are not helpful to our understanding of Judaism or of ourselves today. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we ought to be very cautious about some of Paul's rhetoric here, and remember that it is rhetoric for the situation that he's confronting, and it has had a kind of unfortunate history in the Christian world, where Jews have been often demonized, and the language that's used by Paul here of Judaism somehow being connected with slavish things, language like that is not helpful and not right. And in some ways, I think we've come to appreciate what the people on the other side of this debate probably stood for, and that was the sense that being in covenant with God, obeying Torah, is a gift, a gift and a grace that one should celebrate and enjoy and rejoice in. So that's a part of the reality on the other side of the debate that Paul's rhetoric doesn't capture. However much he wants to, and we would approve of him celebrating the extension of God's gracious hospitality to Gentiles and his adoption of people who were not part of the traditional people of God into the divine family. However much we can approve of that, we can say, Paul, gee whiz, I wish you hadn't used some of this language. And I think that when he gets to Romans and rethinks some of the issues that were on the table here in Galatians, he changes his tone and emphasizes very strongly, especially in chapters 9 through 11, the endurance of God's promises to the people of Israel.
Not just the discontinuity.
And the hope for all of Israel to participate in this eschatological reality. So I think at some point he probably rethinks how to speak about some of the issues that he's talking about here.
Oh, that's helpful. Then in the next section, he goes on to kind of reiterate his concern about circumcision and Christian freedom, and he talks in two odd and somewhat contradictory ways. One, in certainly the strongest verse of the whole thing in chapter 5, verse 12, where he says, I wish those who unsettle you would castrate themselves. One of the early translations says, I wish they'd let the knife slip, which I thought was not a bad way of trying to pass that over euphemistically. So that's just polemical and angry. On the other hand, he somehow wants to identify himself with Christ and with crucifixion, and that crucifixion stands over against circumcision. That's all very puzzling to me.
Well, there are a number of things going on here in this last chapter. I think, there's still some of this if you will, pointed language.
Yeah, well done, yes.
And there may be another little play going on there, because in the background there's another cult. We talked about the pagan gods and the like, the elemental spirits back there in chapter 4. And there was the cult of the mother goddess in Asia Minor, whose priestly devotees did castrate themselves. And so Paul may be saying, look, if you want to go in this direction, why don't you go all the way to
the way and join
the count of the Dea Syria.
Either way, it's not very warm and friendly.
No, it's very pointed language. But Paul, I think, is doing two things in this the beginning of this chapter. One is making some apologetic moves, and saying he's forestalling readings of his own position. And one of them might be, okay, Paul, you say that we are called to freedom. Does that mean anything goes? Are there any limits on our behavior, any norms that we ought to be following? And Paul says, of course there are. And he'll come back and do this even more systematically and more forcefully in Romans.
Right.
The idea is already
cites the objections.
Right. He's already here worried about that. So on the one side, he has to say, look, if you're going to get circumcised, then I know that you have to obey the whole law. I was once there. I was a Pharisee, and that's what it means to be a member of the covenant people, is to live in that covenant.
You can't do covenant light.
You can't do it halfway. But not to do it, not to be circumcised, doesn't mean that you don't have a moral order.
Fair enough.
And he insists on this finally. Verse 6 of chapter 5 is in some ways the encapsulation of his whole position here. In Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. It's indifferent. Okay? The only thing that counts is faith working through love.
Yeah.
But faith does have to work through love.
Yeah, yes.
It does have to work through love, whether you're a member of the covenant people or not.
You can't say, I have faith, I don't give a darn about you.
Right. If you're a member of the covenant people, fine.
Yeah.
Observe Torah.
Yeah.
If you're not a member of the covenant people, you still have to
there's still an obligation.
have to love.
No, I think that's very good. And we come around to that at in chapter 14, in verse 14, where he sums up the law.
That's right.
With neighbor love.
That's right.
Yeah.
So having established that little bit of apology, he's going to build on that through the chapter into some exhortations.
One of the things that puzzles me about this a little bit, and it's always puzzled me, and I want your wisdom on it, is that I know why he gets worried about the flesh in the first place, because flesh is circumcision, and it's worrying about a visibly physical and fleshly thing. But then somehow flesh, when we get here, becomes a much larger category. There are all kinds of things that are flesh-related and contrasted to the better things, which are spirit-related. What's this flesh-spirit dichotomy about as you read it?
This is one of Paul's favorite dichotomies.
Okay.
And he's quite happy to use antitheses or dichotomies in various places. He certainly does in Romans and in 2 Corinthians. But the flesh-spirit one is really big for him. And in some ways, it resembles what goes on in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in Jewish apocalyptic thinking, where there are two spirits that govern the world, the spirit of truth, the spirit of light, the spirit of darkness. Yeah. And similar, too, to what goes on in rabbinic thinking about the human self and the two yetzers, the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, the inclinations that are part of human nature. So there are these dichotomous ways of thinking about the human condition that we find in a lot of Jewish traditions, and they map out differently onto a cosmological scheme or an ethical scheme. Paul is probably not coming from a body-soul dichotomy that we find in Greek philosophical tradition, although he knows that as well. No, this seems to be a kind of ethical division of things.
Okay.
And flesh is not simply, the corpuscles of our fatty body and the blood that flows through it, but it's the whole set of attitudes and involvements of human beings that often can lead them away from God. And spirit is that orientation of the self toward God and toward God's will for humankind. And I think that's the way in which this dichotomy works. And he says we're all there in flesh. And we're all drawn in ways that alienate us from God, but we have the gift now of life in Christ that draws us in another way. So his exhortations in chapter 5, verse 16 and on very much play on these ethical dimensions of spirit and flesh. Live by the Spirit, he says. Don't gratify the desires of the flesh. And then he has a list of vices in verse 19, and a list of, we'll call them virtues for a moment, in verse 22. And the vices are the sorts of things that lots of moralists in the first century would include under things you should avoid.
Right.
Whether you're a
not
pagan moralist or a Jewish moralist, with the exception perhaps of idolatry.
Right.
That would definitely mark
be just fine in some circles,
a Jewish approach to things. On the other side, you have the fruits of the Spirit. Sometimes we think about these as accidents, but I think they're really calls to behavior. They're virtues that Paul says.
I do too.
That includes something like joy, which you can say is a kind of hallmark of Paul's approach to things. It's something you're called upon to do, not just experience. In any case, Paul will exploit the ethical dimensions of this flesh-spirit dichotomy, and it's clear how he does so here.
Do you think there's any, this is, I'm sure, one of my preaching moves, so I'm not sure how we can do it all in terms of interpreting the text, but the distinction between works of the flesh and fruits of the Spirit, that you work at the bad stuff and the good stuff is the fruit of God's working within you? I have no idea, but it's an interesting shift.
Right. Well, it is interesting how in a lot of Paul's ethical exhortations, there's a play on two dimensions of what it is to lead the good and moral life. It's something that's a gift of God. But it's also something that you're called upon
to do.
So divine initiative and human responsibility are both there.
Come together.
In Paul's
As
mixture.
with faith, as we saw earlier on.
Right.
Well, then we come to the farewells, which is as with so many of his letters, this has all been deeply pastoral, but now becomes kind of concretely practical. Mm-hmm. What are some of the concerns you think we need to carry away from this letter in terms of who Paul thinks the Galatians ought to be and what they should be doing with each other?
Well, there are the general exhortations, the love command from Leviticus, right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of an
Absolutely.
overarching thing.
Right.
Then there are the kind of the detailed exhortations. We saw the virtues and things, but then bearing one another's burdens in chapter 6 is an interesting exhortation. So he wants this community to be not simply a community of mutual respect, but active engagement.
Yeah.
And that's something that he wants for all of his communities,
Yeah.
the real solidarity. It's interesting, there's a bit of a tension in that set of exhortations at the beginning of chapter 6, where he says on the one side, bear one another's burdens, and in that way fulfill the law of Christ, and then says, for all must carry their own loads.
Yeah. I will not make a contemporary political comment at this point. Tempting as it would be.
Well, I think he's in effect saying, we do have responsibility for one another, and those who have means should bear that responsibility in a particular way, but everybody has responsibility.
Has to hold in,
Yeah. So in any case, that's the way look at the language he uses in verse 2. That's the way you fulfill the law of Christ. Here he's been arguing all the way through that law, Torah, is not binding on Christians, but the law, the Torah of Christ, is.
Absolutely is, yeah.
And this gets back to the apologetic dimension of what he was saying at the beginning of chapter 5. We're not absolved from moral responsibility by this path that he has sketched.
Yeah.
Being a child of God involves moral responsibility as well.
And then nearly at the end, return to the stress on the cross and the crucifixion and what it means for Christ to be crucified and for Paul to be part of that crucified reality.
Right. No, you spoke early on in our conversations about the centrality of the Christ event, the cross and resurrection, for Paul's understanding of himself, where he is in salvation history, where he is in the divine plan. And that focus on the cross of Christ will come back in various ways in his letters, in 1 Corinthians, the first 4 chapters there, in Philippians, which we'll talk about on another occasion. So Paul is getting back to some fundamental things here. And he repeats in verse 15 of that concluding paragraph his judgment about circumcision, which has been the presenting issue all along. Circumcision or uncircumcision is nothing, neither is of any importance. The new creation is everything. Here's that theme of the new creation.
Which is kind of, I think, a marvelous way of summing up what the whole thing has been. First it was faith working through love. That's good. That's the real thing. Now the real thing is also new creation, which is what you said all along, both what God does and what we do. It's both gift and response.
Right. And then there's an interesting little blessing that he utters there in verse 16. As for those who follow this rule, who obey this halakha, to put it in Jewish terms, and the halakha is what? The law of Christ. Those who obey that rule, peace be upon them. But this blessing has 2 parts. Peace be upon them and mercy upon the house of Israel. And some people read the latter as a way of labeling the former, that is, all of those who
are the new
adopted,
now we're now
Israel. I don't think Paul is there. I think he's saying the same thing that he'll expand upon in Romans 9 through 11. Israel is Israel and always will be so, and peace and mercy upon them as well. There are 2 halachot, 2 ways, 2 laws that people can follow as members of this new covenant community. Either the Torah of Moses or the law of Christ.
And becomes then surprisingly expansive at the end.
Yes.
After having been strongly clear on the distinctions.
Right.
Thank you, sir. I actually still understand why Martin Luther likes it so much.
It's a great letter.
Yeah. Thank you.